Hello, I'd like to welcome everyone to the webinar. I appreciate you signing on this morning. Today is March 20th. We'll be discussing ATI research and innovations in technology and educational practice. We will be sharing the Galileo pre-K and K-12 growth models to assess and enhance school readiness. The webinar today is brought to you by Assessment Technology Incorporated, presented by Dr. Sarah Callahan, research scientist, and Dr. Jason Feld, Vice President of Corporate Projects, both with ATI, and facilitated by myself, Jody Jepson, Senior Communications Coordinator. We thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule. We know you have a lot of choices this morning, and we appreciate you logging on. Please let me introduce Dr. Jason Feld.
Thank you, Jody, and good morning, everybody. We're glad you can join us today. We have participants from around the country, down south in Alabama, Colorado, a lot of participants from Florida, Ohio, New York, North Carolina, Texas, and Wisconsin. If I missed anybody, just welcome. We have representation from federally funded programs, private early childhood programs, and public schools as well. This particular webinar, among the ones that we are doing this year, is unique in that the major focus is going to be on research. I know most of you are used to seeing Galileo. We're going to show you some of that. But the focus will, in fact, be on research and the integration of the work that we're doing around the country in birth through 5, but the more important linkage as we move from 5 up through the early elementary school years and on to high school, for that matter. The reason we're doing this is because we are, in fact, in a new paradigm for school readiness. This past year, we did conduct a webinar related to school readiness. For those of you that were not able to see it, it is on our website and it is recorded. We're not going to go through it now, but just be aware that, in fact, that webinar is available for you to look at. I will just go ahead back to here. Okay, the major framing I want to do this morning is that we are in a new paradigm for school readiness, and that new paradigm is focused on not only school readiness related to the Head Start performance standards and the early learning framework, but also State Department of Education early childhood requirements, as well as the Common Core state standards. At this point in time, we have aligned the Galileo system to Common Core, to pre-K, and to kindergarten in the states that you see here. Again, this is on our website, so at any point in time that you wish, you can go ahead and take a look at that and see what's going on with our website. The reason we're focusing on this new paradigm for school readiness is because there has been a changing landscape over the past couple of years. It is a major discussion right now in pre-K as well as in K-12, and in fact it is occurring not only through pre-K standards but also through Common Core and next generation science standards, as well as 21st century learning. As a result of that, the shift in readiness has gone beyond the traditional focus of simply readiness for kindergarten, and we are now moving toward a much more inclusive concept of readiness that extends throughout early childhood and youth and even into what is called now college and career readiness. This refocus on readiness across the country has now shifted us from simply a point-in-time event, the transition to kindergarten and the early years, to really a continuous lifelong process. And that shift has been accompanied by some major advances and innovations in technology and research and practice, and those are the things we would like to share with you today. In terms of our movement toward the new paradigm, we're going to be focusing on 3 major activities that we've been involved in across the country the last couple of years. The first is a quick overview again of the Galileo Readiness Scales for birth through 5 years of age. Then Sarah is going to talk about research on growth rates not only for birth through 5, but also kindergarten through 3rd grade and 3rd grade and beyond. Again, this research becomes imperative at this point because readiness is not simply something that begins and ends once a child enters school, but it's something that really is now connecting early childhood education with K-12 education. Some quick facts about the Galileo readiness scales, just to bring you up to speed again. Those readiness scales are built out of the Galileo G3 assessment scales and automatically linked to them. As I mentioned earlier, they cover all the domains and domain elements in the Head Start Performance Standards, State Department of Early Childhood, and Common Core state standards. The unique component of the readiness scales is that they're not simply scales that discuss how many things a child has learned or what a child has learned, or if the child is at an age-appropriate level or a certain a level of performance. We are focused on really a child's development along a path of learning, and that path is in fact empirically validated. Just to give you a quick visual, the traditional way of looking at readiness is to simply look at observations within different periods of time and to record where the child is in terms of what the child has learned. In the new approach to readiness, we're actually looking at child development along a developmental path. And the goal of observational assessment is to identify where that child is on that path so we know what the child has already learned and the likelihood of the child being able to learn the next skills in the developmental sequence. This has major implications not only for planning birth through 5, but also in the transition to kindergarten and that continuing transition for readiness throughout the child's learning K through 12. I do want to show you real quickly as well another document that is available to you on the website, and this is the direct alignment between the Galileo readiness scales birth through 3 and 3 to 5 with the Head Start child development and learning framework domains. Again, this information is available to you on our website, and you can access it anytime you wish. The next thing I just want to talk about real quickly is what is covered by the readiness scales. As many of you already know, there are readiness assessments and instructional tools for birth through 8, 8 to 18, 18 to 24, and so forth. The readiness scales are organized into 5 knowledge areas in the 3 to 5 scales, and those are here. And the thing that I do want to point out is that in addition to data that we're providing at the local program level, we are also posting readiness information on the internet. One of the areas that we posted is directly through the National Head Start Association website. On that website you will see a link that's called Full Research Studies, and you simply click on the ongoing research studies for a portrait of child outcomes. To show you real quickly what that looks like on the internet, we will go to that component. We're on the Head Start site. You simply click on Portrait of Child Outcomes. That will take you to the portrait, explain what it does, and then if you simply click on National Data, it will take you to an interface where you can actually look at children's readiness across the country as well as their performance on the Galileo 3 to 5 scales. I'm going to go back here a little bit, back to the presentation, and continue along. One of the things I want to show you now are some examples of the reports that are available on that national portrait. I'm going to go ahead and bring up one that I generated just a day or so ago. Again, this data is occurring in real time, so it's actually second by second, moment by moment. I simply grabbed some data a little while ago for up through March 17th. You can see that the sample size we grabbed is 34,000 children across the country. And again, this is the 3 to 5 Galileo Readiness Scale. You can see the number of children that have actually acquired these capabilities, as well as information related to planning for next steps. You'll also notice another report that is on that national portrait. This one actually shows growth of children. Again, it's a fairly large sample, over 28,000 children in early childhood. Again, this is the 3 to 5 scale, but this is also run for the birth through 8 to 18 months and so forth. And you can see that we're experiencing some very nice growth in terms of children's readiness for the next steps in their development as we've moved from fall data to data that is actually available now in the month of March. Whoops, excuse me. I want to now just quickly go through how teachers and administrators are using the readiness scales, and then I will be turning it over to Sarah to start to talk about the research. As I mentioned earlier, the readiness scales are drawn from the Galileo G3 assessment scales. These are the capabilities that are very specific to readiness. These readiness scales allow the teachers to fully document children's development and helps teachers to narrow and refine their focus on the readiness goals for entering school. The Galileo School Readiness Scales for 3 to 5 are available in Spanish, and the Galileo Readiness Scales for children birth through 3 will soon be ready in their Spanish version for use this coming fall. In terms of an administrator's use of the readiness scales, administrators can aggregate data for readiness within a center across their program. At the state level, we can aggregate it there as well. We have added a brand new report this year to the readiness tools in Galileo, as well as the Galileo G3 scales, which is called an outcome analysis report. That report is used to help program administrators continuously improve their program related to what they're doing with their curriculum and their teaching and instructional strategies. This report is also used by program administrators to determine whether or not the curriculum they've chosen and are implementing in their program is really producing the desired outcomes for children. I'm going to show you some quick views of that outcomes analysis report. And again, it is available to you. And you can access it anytime in Galileo. This particular one I generated just a day or two ago in March, and it's showing basically readiness developmental level scores that I spoke about earlier for birth through 8 to 18, 18 to 24, 2 to 3, and 3 to 5. The nice thing here is that you can actually see the progress that's being made in terms of readiness during these periods. We also provide on this brand new report the average developmental level score, which is the key and most important score that you can generate in Galileo, again, because it talks about a child's ability rather than simply how many things a child can do. And ability becomes a major factor not only in early childhood education, but also as we make the shift across the country to Common Core state standards. Not only in pre-K, but also K-3. We're interested in changes in children's ability and their deepening knowledge rather than simply how many things a child can do on a checklist. The other part of that report I'll display for you as well. This is a kind of a 30,000-foot view of the report. Here's the interface I showed you earlier. Here is another component where it actually shows progress from beginning to intermediate to advanced over a period of time. Again, these are drill down features, so you can actually go in and look at individual schools and children. And at the request of programs across the country, we've also added now a print button, so this can actually be printed out and shared with decision makers, boards, parent councils in your program. Okay, I'm now going to shift the discussion over to my colleague and friend, Sarah Callahan. Sarah has been heading up the research we've been doing in terms of readiness, not only birth through 5, but also K through 12. And again, as I said earlier, the most important thing that we feel needs to be brought to the table right now in this changing paradigm is really the research that undergirds decision making related to not only enhancing school readiness, but sustaining school readiness over time and making a very clear and actionable connection between what happens in early childhood education and the continuing development of children's readiness and their successes as they move through the early elementary school years. With that, I thank you all. I'll be back in a little while, and I'm turning it over to Sarah.
Thank you, Jason. So as Jason mentioned, I'll be talking today about two aspects of the ongoing research program here at ATI. The first will be related to research on growth rates for children in preschool, birth through 5. And then we'll move on and talk about predictive validity and forecasting accuracy research related to the Galileo assessments administered by districts in kindergarten through 3rd grade, and then also 3rd grade through high school. So first, we'll sort of start working from the little kiddos upward. So as those of you who are using Galileo pre-K online know, Galileo provides early childhood programs with measures of child growth, along with specific information about which capabilities the child has learned and which capabilities the child is ready to learn. And this information is critical in tracking child progress along an empirically based developmental path and guiding the planning of developmentally appropriate learning opportunities. So the goal of ATI growth rate research is to provide an additional piece of information about how much growth programs can expect over a given time period for children of various age ranges and in various developmental domains. So in particular, we'll be talking about growth rates related to the 11 domains measured by the Galileo scales for 3 through 5 years, as well as the 5 domains measured by the Galileo birth through 3 scales. And we've also conducted growth rate research for those school readiness scales, which are comprised of capabilities drawn from the assessment scales. The benefit of growth rate research is that it can assist programs in evaluating whether children are growing at an adequate rate throughout the year, and this supports the planning of timely intervention and enrichment initiatives. So first, let's talk about the measures that Galileo uses to calculate child growth. So as Jason mentioned earlier, ATI uses procedures based in item response theory to estimate information about the capabilities within each Galileo scale. In particular, we call these parameter estimates. And they tell us things about the capabilities, such as how difficult they are, or how well the capability discriminates between children of various abilities. So based on this information, these parameter estimates, and the observational assessment data collected by programs for a child, Galileo can provide an estimate of the child's ability for a given developmental domain, which we call the developmental level score, or DL score. And since we place these DL scores within an age range and domain on a common scale, we can measure child growth via the change in the DL score over time. So for these particular studies, we'll be talking about children's growth was evaluated in, as I mentioned, the 5 domains for birth through 3, 11 domains from 3 through 5, as well as the school readiness domains. And there is a 12th domain in 3 through 5 technology, which we've recently introduced, and we'll be evaluating growth for that coming out soon. So for these studies, we used data from programs that are already using Galileo to conduct observational assessments. There were more than 40 programs in 16 states nationwide using the Galileo birth through 3 scales in the sample for this study, and more than 80 programs in 24 states nationwide using the Galileo 3 through 5 scales. On average, for children ages birth through 3, approximately 12 observations were conducted for each child for each scale throughout the 2012-13 program year, representing more than 14,000 observations for more than 1,000 children. And for children ages 3 through 5, on average, 9 observations were conducted, representing more than 126,000 observations for more than 14,000 children. So these are very large samples. So now we'll get down to the statistical heart of the matter, and I know that you may all have varying familiarity with statistics, so I'll try to make this as easy as possible to understand. So basically, for those of you who are familiar with this type of analysis, the analyses we conducted here are called linear regression analyses. Essentially, what these analyses do is evaluate the relationship between child developmental level score and time. For this study, we quantified time in terms of the number of days. And as you can see in this sample scatter plot here, we have developmental level score on the vertical axis, and time on the horizontal axis, again in days. So this is 60 days, 120 days, etc. Each of these dots represents a child's developmental level score at a certain time point. So for example, this is probably a score of about 225, representing about 50 days into the year. And what the regression analysis does is it plots this line here in blue. So it establishes the line that best describes the entire cloud of dots. And what this line tells us is that the slope of the line, or the amount that the DL score increases for every one increment in time, so for a 1-day increase in the DL score, that's our daily growth rate. So now let's get right to the results. So first, talking about children birth through 3. I'm just going to jump right to our table here. And these tables are all available within the research briefs related to these studies if you want to look at them in more detail. But I'll just be giving a broad overview here. So first, as you can see in this table, we have all of the scales for different age ranges and developmental domains. We have the daily growth rate, and remember, this is only 1 day, so these are, small growth rates for any given day. But then what that daily growth rate allows us to do is actually expand it out into an expected growth value for any given time period. So here, just for illustration purposes, we've provided the expected growth for 1 month, or 30 days, as well as the expected growth for the entire age range spanned by the scale. So for 0 to 8 months, this represents 8 months of growth. If you scroll through this table, what you can see is that in general, growth rates are similar across a variety of developmental domains within a given age range. However, they do begin to increase as the age ranges increase. So we see more growth in the older children. Now, given that we know that DL scores have a standard deviation of approximately 50 points, when we add up the expected growth across all of the age ranges, it reveals that child DL scores are expected to increase by approximately 102 points from birth through age 3, and this is approximately 2 standard deviations of growth. So children are growing quite a bit between birth to 3. Looking at the same information for now the 3 through 5 year scales. First, you can see here that growth rates are higher for 3 through 5 years, which is consistent with the pattern we observed of increasing growth rates as age increases. And in fact here, again, given that we know that approximately 50 points represents 1 standard deviation, you can see that children on average are growing more than 2 standard deviations over 1 program year, or 9 months. So, summarizing the two growth rate studies that I just presented, these studies evaluated growth in a large nationwide sample of children in the 12-13 program year in a variety of age ranges. The regression analyses established growth rates for each Galileo scale. And based on this research, programs can estimate the amount of growth children should show in a given developmental domain for a given time period. This helps programs evaluate whether children are growing at an adequate rate, and if a specific child or group of children is not demonstrating adequate growth, the program can make adjustments to the curriculum and provide additional learning opportunities as needed to promote growth and readiness. So now we're going to move on to the second major research topic, and this is related to validity and forecasting. So as Jason described earlier, the refocusing of readiness from a single readiness for school to a continuous lifelong progress highlights the importance of readiness throughout early childhood and extending all the way up through college and career readiness. Local assessment and instructional initiatives designed to increase student readiness over time are enhanced by valid assessments that provide continuous, accurate forecasting of standards mastery at critical time points. So when we're talking about, the school years in K-12, one of those critical time points is at the time of the statewide test. Forecasting information with respect to statewide test performance assists teachers to guide instruction towards improved skill acquisition, and as a result help children and students improve performance on statewide tests. And it also provides administrators with advanced information that they can use to guide the allocation of resources aimed at promoting readiness and standards mastery. So, ATI annually investigates the predictive validity and forecasting accuracy of Galileo assessments, and we're going to be presenting two studies today. So first, we evaluate predictive validity by looking at the correlation between student scores on district or charter-wide Galileo assessments and their ultimate scores on the statewide assessment. We investigate forecasting accuracy by looking at how students who are classified at different levels of risk for failing the statewide assessment based on their performance on Galileo assessments ultimately do perform on the statewide assessment. So the first study is a case study in a single Arizona district evaluating the predictive validity and forecasting accuracy of the Galileo assessments administered in kindergarten through third grade in math and English language arts. The second study will take a broader view and look at the Galileo assessments administered by 26 districts in 3 states in grades 3 through high school in math and ELA as well as in science. So again, just like we have in Galileo Pre-K Online and Galileo K-12 Online, ATI performs an Irt analysis for each Galileo assessment. This Irt analysis ensures that the reliability of the assessment is adequate, and it also produces a developmental level score for each student that, again, just like in preschool, places that student on a developmental path towards mastery. In addition to the DL score, each student is also classified within Galileo as to their level of risk of not passing the statewide assessment. And this classification is based on their performance on all the Galileo assessments within a given school year. An initial classification or risk level is provided after the student takes the first assessment, and then this risk level is refined as they take additional assessments throughout the year. So there are 4 possible risk levels in order of increasing risk: on course, low risk, moderate risk, and high risk. In terms of the data provided by districts and charters with respect to the statewide test performance of students, each student has a scale score. This is something akin to the developmental level score, and is also classified in terms of whether or not they pass the statewide test. So these are the 2 pieces of information we're going to use to conduct those predictive validity and forecasting accuracy analyses. So again, we get to the statistics at the heart of it all. For the predictive validity analyses, the relevant statistic is called a correlation statistic. What this statistic does is it evaluates the strength of the relationship between the DL scores on Galileo assessments and the student scale scores on the statewide assessment. You can have correlations that range from -1 to +1. However, in this context, we typically only see positive correlations. And a positive correlation indicates that high scores on one measure are associated with high scores on the other. So students who have higher developmental level scores also have higher scale scores on the statewide assessment. And in terms of evaluating the strength of a correlation between 0.5 and 0.7 indicates a moderate relationship, and a correlation between 0.7 and 0.9 indicates a strong or high correlation. So these little graphs just give you an idea here of the strength of various correlations. So basically, you have the two measures represented here on the two axes, so it would be DL score and scale score. And as you can see, in a positive correlation, as DL score increases, scale score also increases on the statewide assessment. So now, moving on to how we conduct the forecasting accuracy analyses. Well, although the risk levels within Galileo really represent a continuum of risk, for the purpose of evaluating the accuracy of these risk levels, we need to make a classification. So for convenience, we consider students classified as on course or low risk as being predicted to pass the statewide assessment, while students classified as moderate or high risk are predicted not to pass the statewide assessment. In general, ATI considers forecasting accuracy to be adequate if risk level accurately predicts performance for at least 75% of students. And we'll a little bit later talk about some of the reasons that less accuracy in forecasting can actually sometimes be a good thing. So first we're going to start with kindergarten through third grade, and forecasting in terms of performance on the statewide test assessment, which in many states is not administered until the end of third grade, has become increasingly important with the introduction of different levels of accountability based on that initial administration of the statewide assessment. So for example, in some states there are requirements related to student performance on the statewide assessment at the end of third grade that have pretty large consequences for students, such as retention. So this case study involved a large Arizona district and the assessments that they administered in kindergarten through third grade. This particular district had been using Galileo for a number of years, since 2004, and so we're actually able to track students all the way from kindergarten through the end of third grade. In each year, the district was administering Galileo assessments, and then we were provided with the statewide test data, in this case for the Ames assessment, that is administered at the end of third grade. So we could actually look at how well Galileo assessments forecast statewide test performance, even up to 4 years in advance of the statewide test. So on average, the sample size for each of these assessments was over 1,700 students. So we've already talked about the types of analyses that we'll be performing here, so let's jump straight to the results. So here we have the statewide the Galileo assessments administered in each grade and content area in math and ELA, and then their correlation with the statewide assessment administered at the end of third grade in the relevant content area. And as you can see, as you would expect, the strength of the correlation increases as the time between the two measures decreases. So recall, these are kindergartners, their scores on kindergarten assessments with respect to the statewide assessment administered 4 years later. And so even so, you can see that even 4 years prior, the correlations are still moderate. And by the time we get up to contemporary Galileo assessments administered in the same year as the statewide assessment, you can see that they're very strong correlations. So this suggests a strong relationship between Galileo assessments and the statewide assessment. In terms of forecasting accuracy, this represents the overall forecasting accuracy for all of the Galileo risk groups. And you can see that forecasting accuracy is very high again, even 4 years before the statewide assessment, Galileo risk levels are accurately identifying which students are likely to fail the statewide assessment at levels of 86 and 87%. And again, when we work up to the same year of the statewide assessment, 92 and 95% of students were classified accurately. So this suggests that this information really can be used to identify students even several years in advance of the statewide assessment. We also would expect that higher levels of risk should be associated with lower pass rates on the statewide assessment. And in fact, that's exactly the pattern we observe both in ELA here, where you can see that on-course students, very high percentages of them are actually going on to pass the statewide assessment, while less as you move to low risk, moderate risk, and high risk. And the same basic pattern is also observed here for math. Now, one very interesting thing you can see here is that some of the students who were initially classified at higher levels of risk do in fact go on to pass the statewide assessment. And this is evidence of the efficacy of early interventions administered in grades kindergarten through 3 in advance of the statewide assessment. So basically, summarizing the conclusions from this investigation of forecasting and validity in grades kindergarten through 3rd, first of all, it's clear that Galileo assessments demonstrate high levels of predictive validity and forecasting accuracy. These scores correlate well with student scale scores on the statewide assessment at the end of 3rd grade, and the risk levels accurately forecast ultimate student performance on 3rd grade aims. Again, I think one of the most interesting results here is also that evidence that early intervention efforts can be effective in many cases in reducing student risk of not passing the statewide assessment. For this reason, it's critical that early childhood assessments provide not only student risk classifications, but also detailed information that can support the implementation of effective early interventions. So for example, Galileo provides this information in the intervention planning report in terms of a list of standards on which instruction should be focused to help improve student mastery and reduce student risk of failing the statewide assessment. So now we're just going to look at that broader view of validity and forecasting in grades 3 through high school. So a very similar study, however, in this case we have 26 districts. These just happen to be the first districts who provided ATI with their 2012 statewide assessment data in grades 3 through high school in math, ELA, and science. And these districts represent 3 states and more than 1,100 Galileo assessments in these grades and content areas. So again, we'll look at the correlations for evidence of predictive validity. And again, as we see here, correlations were uniformly high in all grades and content areas, indicating a strong relationship between scores on Galileo assessments and scores on the statewide assessment. Looking now at forecasting accuracy. So first we see that by now familiar pattern of increasing risk being associated with decreased pass rates on the statewide assessment. And this is pretty typical. This was from the 11-12 Galileo assessments and the 2012 statewide test. And I'll tell you that the 2012-13 data is coming out any day now. And this is pretty typical with what we observe almost every year in terms of this. Again, if we look at overall forecasting accuracy, we can see that overall accuracy is quite high. Recall that I mentioned that 75% is sort of our watermark in terms of effective forecasting. And here, in this case, more than 84% of students overall were forecast accurately. And as you would expect, forecasting accuracy is highest in those cases where students are consistent. So on-course students are consistently passing Galileo assessments, and as you can see, they also consistently pass the statewide assessment. High-risk students are consistently failing Galileo assessments, and here most of them do in fact fail the statewide assessment. And again, here you see more evidence of the efficacy of those interventions. Low and moderate risk students are also performing as would be expected. These are students who show variable performance, the quote-unquote bubble kids, and they also show more variable performance on the statewide test. So overall, again, we see that now moving in grades 3 through high school, Galileo assessments continue to demonstrate adequate levels of predictive validity and forecasting accuracy for the statewide assessment. Again, we see evidence that effective interventions can in fact reduce student risk. And for this reason, we congratulate our districts on proving us wrong in certain cases by making our predictions inaccurate, which is what we hope for all students who are predicted to fail the statewide test.
Thank you, Dr. Callahan. We appreciate your presentation today. It's time now to answer some of the questions that have been sent in. Dr. Feld, I sent one to you earlier if you'd like to address that.
Sure, I'd be happy to do so. And thanks again, Sarah. Before I respond to, I've got a lot of questions. We're responding to most of them directly via the internet, but I will address a few here. What I'm hoping at this point you all are seeing is that within this new readiness paradigm, the importance of research for early childhood programs becomes really critical in terms of being able to predict what they're doing now, the effect of what they're doing now on later outcomes for children. 20 years ago, I was involved in research looking at the transition of Head Start children to elementary school, and in that study we looked at fade-out or catch-up effects. 20 years later, that still seems to be a challenge, but we think at this point, certainly in our work in early childhood education, we've identified a critical piece of research that we're now embedding in Galileo to really not so much close the achievement gap, but basically raise all boats together. The Irt analysis becomes a critical component of this research, and certainly in our view essential for use in early childhood and K-12 education to make that connection a reality in a practical sense. The first question that came in, and I'll just read it, if you are a teacher in a pre-K class, would you use scales for their age, 3 to 5, regardless of their abilities, even though they may be at the 2 to 3 level? That is a really great question. As you recall from Sarah's presentation as well as mine, the issue of readiness is not primarily a function of age. It's a function of ability. Age does play a very, very important role. However, in terms of providing learning opportunities that are really aligned with a child's readiness for next steps, you do want to use that ability level. We have many programs that do in fact dip down to the earlier scales so that they are matching their observations to the ability levels of children, and then as children progress they move up to the higher scales. Again, that's the benefit of having a birth through 5 and then really a 5 through high school research-based continuum, as opposed to trying to plug a child into a curriculum or a particular observation approach that's based on age. So the short answer to that is you want to use the scale that has the best match to the child's ability. Second question I got had to do with the portrait we showed earlier. The question is, can I use the national portrait of readiness to compare how our program is doing relative to the nation? The short answer to that is no, that's not the intent of the portrait. The intent of the portrait is to really create a community across the nation so that individual programs can take a look really second by second on what's happening with school readiness and to get a sense of challenges that programs across the country are facing as well as their successes. Your best bet in helping Children, get ready to be successful is to use the assessment tools in your program and look at those reports at that level. Each program is unique. Each program has its own customized approach to curriculum development and implementation, and it's the data on your children that really matters most. The third question I'll answer real quickly. Actually, there's one from a school district and one from an early childhood program. The school district question is, how do we get access to looking at some of the tools for K through 3 in Galileo? That's pretty straightforward. Just give us a holler, and we can go ahead and make those available to you so you can take a look and see what's going on. The second question is, I noticed that you've done some of this research in Arizona and Massachusetts and other states. Can it be done in my state with my program in my school district? The best answer I can give you to that is if you let us know which state you're from and which school district you're in or which early childhood program you're in, we can take a look to see what types of research we're currently conducting in your state. Those are great questions. I know Sarah's got a few that really is more in her area of expertise, so I'll turn it over to Sarah to answer those.
Great, thanks, Jason. Yeah, and just to reiterate that point, we have a whole research department here, and we're always looking for new research questions and new partners in terms of conducting research. So we're always happy to conduct research with new programs or districts or charters. So I did get a couple questions sort of more related to the research portion of the presentation. So the first question, why are Galileo risk levels based on student performance on multiple tests given throughout the year? Why not just look at student performance on the most recent test? Boy, this is a really common question. I answer this question, seems like at least on a weekly basis. So the short answer to this is that student performance on a single test within Galileo is also an accurate predictor of student performance on the statewide assessment. However, our research has indicated that looking at student performance across multiple tests provides additional benefits. First of all, in terms of increasing the accuracy and also in terms of enabling students really to display different patterns of performance over time. So as I mentioned, some students are very consistent. And by the way, I should also mention this also applies to looking at different observation periods within pre-K. The key here is really looking at the change in DL scores over time. But looking at students' pattern or child's pattern of performance really helps in terms of determining that student's risk. And so that's why we find that the risk levels are actually the best predictor of ultimate student performance and outcomes. And then one other question here related to the growth rate research. Should a teacher expect all children in the class to grow at the same rate? And should a teacher, this is a related one from another observer here, should a teacher expect a child to grow the same amount from April to May as they would from July to August? So these both sort of get at the same issue, which is how are these growth rates intended to be used? So first of all, the growth rates represent, as you saw in that scatter plot with the dots, variability in student DL scores over time or child DL scores over time. So it's quite typical for different children to grow at different rates, and it also is quite typical for growth to vary at different times in the year. What the growth rates provide is a sort of picture of the typical growth of a typical child that serves as a sort of rule of thumb or benchmark or guide that will assist programs in evaluating whether children are showing adequate growth throughout the year and in adjusting. Really the key here is to use that information to adjust the learning opportunities provided to the child. So yes, variability would be expected. These are really sort of, your benchmarks to gauge child growth. So I think we might be running out of time, Jody.
We are. We're really at the conclusion of our webinar today. I know we weren't able to get to everyone's question, but we will have our contact information here on the screen for a moment. You can call us directly. Our email address, phone number, and website is available. I did want to remind you that we will be providing a recording of the webinar. It will be posted on our website. It's ati-online.com. And we appreciate all your questions and comments, and we do appreciate you logging on today. Thank you very much.